you don't know me, I'm Francis Moroney. I am an architectural historian, and I've been at this for a really long time. I'm going to be talking about 20th century classicism together with all of the other trends in 20th century architecture. I will be talking about some of those things that another speaker might actually leave out. But I'm not going to leave those things out. To me, 20th century architecture is kind of a diverse, almost giddily diverse thing. And when you look at the standard textbook on the subject, that aspect of it isn't highlighted at all. To the contrary, many architectural historians take the view that there is a kind of narrative of 20th century architecture. There is a sort of progression towards different forms. And you'll find, if you don't know this about me already, you'll find that I don't accept that. I don't accept that there is a narrative. I think that there are many narratives, and it's sort of been my purpose as an architectural historian all of these years to talk about the different narratives that exist, and not just the one. I'm sure that this isn't the first slide you expected to see in a course on 20th century architecture in New York. But to me, as I was thinking about how I wanted to tell this story, this sets the mood. Because 20th century architecture really begins in New York and elsewhere with a change in mood, not a change necessarily in architectural styles or forms, but a change in mood. And this, I think, captures it. Mrs. Vanderbilt moves to the slums. Mrs. Vanderbilt was Anne Harriman Sands Rutherford Vanderbilt, and this is the slum that she moved to, 1 Sutton Place. Now, I'm sure that any of you who know Sutton Place and have looked at this house don't think of it as a slum property. After all, after Mrs. Vanderbilt lived there, J. Paul Getty lived there, and so on. It's not a slum property. But you know, when Mrs. Vanderbilt moved there, indeed, Sutton Place was a slum. Or people called it that. We don't really use that word much anymore, but back in the day people did. And what they meant by that word was that the area was, first of all, poor. It was a working class neighborhood. There were tenements, and the brownstones that you see here were subdivided. They were rooming houses or boarding houses. There was a lot of industry in the neighborhood. There were coal yards and brick yards and breweries and a lot of noisome waterfront enterprises. And it was a shocking thing when Mrs. Vanderbilt decided, oh, that's where I want to live. Here you see a before shot of Sutton Place. This was before its redevelopment, which began around 1920. And this is that same block after renovation. Yeah? Yeah. The brownstones were remodeled beyond all recognition as the neighborhood was claimed by a much better off class of people than had been living there. It went from being a working class neighborhood to being one of the most upper class neighborhoods in New York City. We have a word for this process. That word is what? Gentrification, right, a word that wasn't coined until 1964, but that doesn't mean that the phenomenon didn't exist. Indeed, it did in 1920. Indeed, this may even be regarded as the golden age of gentrification in New York City. And it was this row house renovation movement that, for me, really sort of shows the change in mood that I'm talking about. The reason for gentrification is that it was no longer possible for well-to-do New Yorkers to build themselves new houses in new neighborhoods. There were no new neighborhoods. Manhattan was used up by about 1900. There was no new uptown pasture to move to any longer. And building new houses, which was what upper-class New Yorkers had always done, was prohibitively expensive. So most upper-class New Yorkers bit the bullet, accepted the inevitable, and moved into apartment buildings. But others decided, you know what, we can kind of double back to our old neighborhoods and buy up these houses for very cheap and hire a clever young architect and make it into something that is unique and kind of exciting. This is the house that Mrs. Vanderbilt lived in before she moved to Sutton Place. We say Mrs. Vanderbilt, leaving out Mr. Vanderbilt, because he died. And when he did so, he left his widow this spectacular Richard Morris Hunt house in view of many, the greatest of all Richard Morris Hunt's houses in New York City. This is the house about which Charles Follen McKim said after it was built, "I sleep better at night knowing it's there." And it set the whole vogue for chateau-style houses, not just in New York, but in America. Anyway, Mrs. Vanderbilt didn't want to live in this house anymore. She really wanted to take her whole lifestyle down a notch. The change in mood that I'm talking about, it's in part a rejection of the Gilded Age, of which Mrs. Vanderbilt had been the product. After World War I, Mrs. Vanderbilt and her friends, her women friends in New York society, all of them Francophiles. You know, in 1920, you could not be a society lady in New York if you didn't speak fluent French. It was as important to speak French as it was in the Russian court to speak French. And these ladies had houses in France. They decided during the war that they weren't going to abandon their houses, that they weren't going to abandon the French, and many of them spent the war years in France. Many of them worked in military hospitals. All of them certainly gave money. The point is that a lot of these New York society women, the ones who'd been among the founders of the Colony Club, for instance, they had seen the horrors of the war up close. Some of them had witnessed the carnage at first hand. You know, Edith Wharton carried supplies to the front lines, and others worked in, as I said, in hospitals. And after the war, many of these ladies felt they could not go back to the way things were. That opulence that we see in that Richard Morris Hunt house, well, that was all fine in 1910. But in 1920, it would no longer do. And so a group of female friends, Anne Vanderbilt, Anne Morgan, the daughter of J.P. Morgan, and Elizabeth Marbury, all decided that they were going to claim this sort of forlorn section of Manhattan. They hired a young, very young, he was like 4 years old architect named Mott B. Schmidt, who was married to an interior designer who worked for these ladies' great friend, Elsie de Wolfe. And he created this compound, as it were, for these very, very wealthy ladies. A compound that is called Sutton Place, but which the press also dubbed that Sapphic Enclave, to use a charming phrase. Anyway, there they lived, and their lifestyles became very, very different from what they'd previously been. The new spirit in the air is one which is distinctly modern. The houses are so much simpler, so much more relaxed, so much smaller. To you and me, these might not be small houses, but to a Vanderbilt or a Morgan, these houses were tiny. And this was a time in American life when everything was changing. Manners and mores were changing. They were becoming much more relaxed. Women's clothing was changing, becoming so much less constraining than it had been for, about the last 500 years. And amid these changes, New York began to take on a different look. There was a different spirit in the air. As I say, it was the spirit of modernity, but not the spirit of what we would call modernism. That is to say, this was the architecture that embodied the spirit of modernity. And it didn't begin with World War I. This is an important point that I think we should all remember. It actually begins with the century. It begins at the beginning of the 20th century, or at least in the first decade of the 20th century, when there was a new spirit in the air, when people felt the new century betokened extraordinary things and kind of limitless freedom. And this is when a kind of new approach to old city neighborhoods took root. I don't know how many of you know this house, 139 East 19th Street. It was an 1843 row house, and a Denver architect of very high standing. This was the architect of the Fisher and Daniels building in Denver, of the Denver Athletic Club, of the Antlers Hotel in Colorado Springs. So this was a major architect. Frederick Junius Sterner was his name. He came to New York and he saw this sort of dilapidated Greek Revival row house on East 19th Street. It looked just like this. That is to say, it looked just like approximately 1,200 Greek Revival row houses that are still standing in New York City. We look at it and we think, well, that's a nice house. I'd like that house. But Sterner thought that the house was kind of dull. He thought it was cookie cutter, that there were just too many like it. And what he wanted to do with his house, and there was no Landmarks Preservation Commission to get in the way, he decided he was going to jazz it up a little. He didn't use that term, jazz it up, but he turned it into a kind of Mediterranean fantasy, where the surface of the house, the front of the house had been red brick. He stuccoed it over and painted it a cream color, kind of eggy cream. By the way, what do you see today? Because the house was restored a couple of years ago with the very close supervision of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. What we see is very, very close to the way Sterner made the house in 1908. Anyway, that sort of cream, he used the green shutters. He left the sills and lintels, but he removed the stoop. Frederick Sterner felt that the typical New York City row house stoop was, in his words, a pompous thing. Now, I happen to love row house stoops, but you can sort of see his point. He felt that these stoops were far too big for houses that were only 20 feet wide. When the stoop sort of takes up half the front of the house. And he thought it made a lot more sense, made the whole feeling of the house less pompous, less heavy, lighter, airier, more carefree, to remove the stoop and put in what we call a basement entrance. Now, you see row houses all over the city that have been de-stooped. And there are a lot of reasons that houses have their stoops removed. There was a time when a lot of these row houses were converted into multiple dwellings, whether modern apartment houses or rooming houses, and it made it much simpler to remove that front stoop and have a street entrance. But in fact, the original de-stooping of row houses in New York was done for reasons of fashion and style, not for practical reasons. So Sterner removed the stoop and didn't just remove it, but also gave the entrance these beautiful accents of Mercer tile, which you can go there today and see. And then the other thing he did, although you can't really see it in this picture, he put in a sloping red tile roof on the house. And when he was done, the house, which was on a block that was filled with red brick Greek Revival houses and slightly later brown stone fronted houses, this house by Sterner stood out like a shaft of light on that street. Everything about this house said modern. It said we've entered into a new era. It said rich people in New York are choosing to live differently from how they've ever lived in the past. Here we see there's 139, and then you see that there's a tremendous variety in the houses on this block, as indeed there is. Because after Sterner made over his own house, together with a banker named Joseph B. Thomas, he bought up many other houses on this block. And by the way, this was not a fancy part of town at the time. The houses were pretty cheap. He bought up a bunch of houses on the block and renovated them all in different ways to create this kind of almost willfully varied picturesqueness along the street. So, for instance, this house right here, which was Thomas's own house, Sterner turned it into a kind of medieval fantasy, which he would also do in his house for the art collector Stephen C. Clark on East 70th Street. Sterner worked in time all over the city. But what he's doing in renovating these houses is, as I said, kind of turning his back on the way things had always been done in New York, where a sort of style would take root, it would become very fashionable, and it would be replicated roughly 1 billion times over the next 15 years, then to be replaced by the next style. Well, the vogue for row house renovation that Sterner set in motion really had legs, at least for a while. This was once a row of very ordinary Greek Revival houses. Then the architect Julius Frank working for Sailors' Snug Harbor, decided to do a little remodeling, and a la Frederick Sterner, in 1916, this row of very ordinary red brick houses on 8th Street was transformed into, yes, another Mediterranean fantasy. And Julius Frank sort of continued that treatment round the corner here on University Place and then along the north side of Washington Mews, carriage mews that once held the stables of the fine houses of Washington Square North, but in 1916, those stables were converted into very chic residences and artists' studios with their outsides done over by Julius Frank in the same style as the houses on 8th Street with which these stables were back to back. And here is another view of Washington Mews. So as we enter into the 20th century, we're not doing so arm in arm quite yet with Le Corbusier. We're entering into the 20th century with a kind of new spirit in the air, which sees things happening like old row houses being renovated and old stables being renovated into often elegant dwellings. This is my favorite of all these row house renovation projects of the time. This was a very sort of tired row of houses on 48th and 49th Streets between 2nd and 3rd Avenues. When the owner of one of the houses, a very wealthy woman named Charlotte Hunnewell Sohr-Chan, decided that by buying up the whole block of houses, that is to say, a row of houses on 48th Street that was, and the houses with which they were back to back on 49th Street, not only could the street fronts of these houses be remodeled in such a way as to create something that was fresh and appealing, but the inside, the backyards of these houses could also receive a unified treatment. And a lot of you probably know of examples in New York where the backyards of row houses have been transformed into a sort of communal gardens or parks. There's McDougal-Sullivan Gardens in the South Village. There's the group of houses around St. John's Church in the West Village, and a couple of other examples. But the one that really stands out is Turtle Bay Gardens. What Mrs. Sohr-Chan did, together with her architects Edward Dean and William Lawrence Bottomley, a name that I'm sure a lot of you in this room know, was they created this sort of private park for the people who lived in the houses. And it was lushly planted. You see these pictures of it from right around the time it was done. Lushly planted with fountains and statuary and so on, all of which, by the way, is still there. And this was sort of the rear terrace of Mrs. Sohr-Chan's once upon a time brownstone, transformed into something that looks every inch of it as though it belongs, I don't know, in Tuscany. But this was, again, something that had really never before been done in New York City, and it was beguiling. What Dean and Bottomley did with the outsides of the houses was also very creative, again, to use that word, beguiling, if not quite as much as the gardens, which you, as the casual passerby, don't get to see. You've got to make friends with someone who lives in one of these houses, you know, like Katharine Hepburn. Well, she's dead, but, you know, that she lived here for many, many years. Anyway, the outsides, nonetheless, are also pretty terrific. Now, that architect whom I mentioned and said you're probably familiar with him, William Lawrence Bottomley. Bottomley was one of the great architects of the 1920s and 1930s in America. He was, people are often surprised to hear this, a native Manhattanite. And all his early works are right here in New York City, like Turtle Bay Gardens. And then a few years later, he was the architect. Well, his firm was called Bottomley, Wagner, and White, but Bottomley himself was the designer of the very famous River House, one of the most famous apartment buildings in New York, all the way east on 52nd Street. But the place that Bottomley's name is forever associated with is the state of Virginia, and particularly Richmond, Virginia. There's a street that's lined with the statuary, and then these magnificent houses, many of which, 8, I believe, in total on Monument Avenue, were designed by Bottomley. But if you look at this house, the Jeffress House at 1800 Monument Avenue, wonderful house, right? But really, what Bottomley was doing was transposing to this rather grand setting in the 1920s that sort of mood of architecture, often expressed in a kind of neo-Georgian idiom that had already taken root in places like Sutton Place in Manhattan. Now, when you've heard that, you go to Monument Avenue, you can really see that it's kind of almost like an enlarged version of Sutton Place. And this sort of thing continued through the 1930s. This is one of my favorite things in New York City. I know that it's not all that much to look at, so it's in part the idea of the thing that appeals to me so much. But it's a group of old tenements, by which I mean, you know, tenements. I mean, places where, you know, immigrant Czechs and Hungarians who worked at very low-paid industrial jobs lived at the beginning of the 20th century. But in the 1930s, a woman named Carmel Snow, who was the editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar. And as such, she was a mover and shaker in the world of fashion in New York. It was, incidentally, she, and not Diana Vreeland, who was the model for the character of Maggie Prescott, played by Kay Thompson in the movie Funny Face. Does that register with anyone in this room? Okay, good. Anyway, she undertook the renovation of these tenements into upper-class apartments. Note the date. It's 1938. And being rich just wasn't what it once was. After World War II, there was federal income tax, and then, you know, the immigration spigot was turned off in 1924, which made it much, much harder to find cheap domestic help. And then the 1930s, everybody was affected. And so by 1938, you know, you just couldn't live in a Richard Morris Hunt mansion anymore. I mean, those days were as remote as, you know, something out of the Old Testament. So what the rich ended up doing was living in these very sort of chicly done up small apartments. Walk-ups they were in converted tenements all the way east on 72nd Street. Now, I'm just wondering if there's one thing that you've noticed as we've gone along about that Sutton Place, and Turtle Bay Gardens, and these houses which we call the black and whites, because the color scheme, well, it's not really black now, but when Mrs. Snow had them done over, she wanted everything to be black. I mean, that was like really cool, black and white, like those black and white checked floors. It was a very Dorothy Draper-ish sort of thing. Anyway, what have these three things got in common? I'm going to stay here till you get it. Huh? Women. They were all developed by women. Women were taking the lead in sort of changing the face of Manhattan in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And there were many other examples as well. But we have sort of the triumvirate of Anne Vanderbilt, Anne Morgan, Elizabeth Marbury at Sutton Place. We have Charlotte Hunnewell Sorchan at Turtle Bay Gardens. We have Carmel Snow at the Black and Whites. And clearly, sort of the new tenor might be described, let's just think about it, as a little bit more feminine than had prevailed in New York real estate up till that point. And if you look at this woman, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, in this painting from 1916 by Robert Henry, you see somebody who looks like she belongs in any of those places. The architecture, the spirit of Sutton Place, of Turtle Bay Gardens, seems to go along with her languid pose and with her clothing, which, if you're a woman of today and you're looking at this painting, you're thinking, well, what's the big deal? But you know, in 1916, it was actually pretty radical for a woman to dress the way Gertrude is depicted in this painting by Henry. The kind of loose-fitting, very unconstraining clothing. There are, no corsets or shirt waists or any of the standard items of feminine clothing of the era. So she's being radical. And she carried, by the way, that painting is the same year as these houses. So think of it in those terms. Think of how putting those things together may help you sort of capture the spirit of the time. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was one of the richest women in the world. She grew up in a house on Fifth Avenue and 58th Street, where Bergdorf Goodman now is. Her parents' house on that site had 137 rooms. If any of you have been to the Breakers in Newport, that was their summer house. That's where they went to relax. And so what did Gertrude decide to do when she came of age? Well, she wanted to be an artist. She was an artist. She was a very fine sculptor, very underrated in my own opinion. She got herself a studio in McDougal Alley in a converted stable. And she eventually had her studio designed by the artist Robert Chandler. It is amazingly still intact. And the building is now the New York Studio School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture, and they'll actually take you to look at her studio if you go in there. It's well worth it. But it's a pretty wild space. And she, being, rich, was able to buy up several adjoining buildings over the years. And she did so not because she needed the space for herself, but because she was a great sort of builder of institutions to aid the artist community of Greenwich Village. She created clubs and studios and galleries for painters until eventually she had acquired several contiguous properties and hired an architect whom she knew named Auguste Noel to combine these houses, give at least most of them a unified facade, and to open them in 1931 as the place where she would show off her extraordinary collection of modern American painting, and thus was the Whitney Museum of American Art born. And this is what it looked like. Noel's design was really highly unusual. Even in 1931, even after Sterner and Bottomley and so on had been doing their things for several years, still what Noel did in kind of making, if you will, the classical language of architecture into his very own plaything was, even to this day, when you walk past this building, very striking and singular. This is the entrance to the Whitney Museum. This is it today. And you see that the materials, the colors, the handling of the columns, that big spread-winged eagle over the name on the building, and so on. There is, to all of this, not just a casual quality, such as we see in the Georgian Revival architecture of Sutton Place, but a downright playful quality that is entering into New York architecture in a way that had maybe never before been seen in quite the same way. This is the inside. It's very traditional, yet at the same time, very light. And all throughout the building, there is always, to this day, a playful quality that I find tremendously appealing. Now, Noel is an architect who had been brought up in the Beaux-Arts tradition. He'd worked for Carrère and Hastings, the architects of the New York Public Library. And so, too, at one time had William Lamb, the architect of the Empire State Building. And once, when I was preparing a lecture on the old Whitney Museum building, which I delivered last year at the New York Studio School, I was lying in bed the night before my lecture, and a thought came to me. It was like a bolt of lightning hit me. And I was forced to decide whether to get up and record my thought or to hope that I remembered it when I woke up. And I decided to hope to remember it when I woke up. Anyway, the thought was this. I knew that this facade reminded me of something, but I couldn't think what. I kept thinking to myself, there's another building in New York. I just know there's another building in New York that looks just like this. And then it hit me. It's the Empire State Building. And then I realized that they were built in the same year. Lamb and Noel knew each other. I mean, there's no smoking gun here. I mean, I don't know if Lamb showed Noel his designs or if Noel showed Lamb his designs. But when you look at them, you see that, I'm trying to get the pointer. You see that these fluted piers are the same. You see that these aluminum frames around the windows are the same. You see that both buildings sport stylized eagles, and it's clear that one or the other, one borrowed from the other, or maybe they both borrowed back and forth. But in any event, this is the miniature Empire State Building. Some of you may remember last year when they were doing restoration work on the front of the building, the New York Studio School sign came down for a very brief time, and there it said, Whitney Museum of American Art. It was very, very cool to walk by there and see that. Now, the other strand of this new spirit is to be found in a different kind of development. Thus far, we've been talking about urban row houses almost exclusively. But there was a persistent dream throughout the 19th century of creating these planned suburbs that would be very elaborately landscaped and allow people to, as it were, live in a central park of their own, a place where the landscape was designed in that romantic manner with curving paths and irregularly shaped lawns and bodies of water, a place that would get you and your soul off the infernal city grid. And indeed, developments took shape in the 19th century. In the 1850s, Llewellyn Park, the first planned picturesque suburb in America, in West Orange, New Jersey, and Riverside in Illinois, which was laid out by no less than Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, with the idea that this was a sort of central park for people to live in. And over time, Riverside was embellished with houses by architects like Frank Lloyd Wright, the Tomek House, and the very famous Avery Coonley House. When Riverside was first created, long before the Frank Lloyd Wright buildings were there, but when Olmsted and Vaux had laid it out and construction of its streets and earliest houses had begun, a young Englishman lived in Chicago. This was sort of a weird bit of fate. This young Englishman, Ebenezer Howard was his name, had come to America with the dream of establishing a kind of utopian farm in Nebraska. And that's a tough thing to pull off, as he realized after about 6 months. And he wound up in Chicago, where he worked as a stenographer. But he was always interested in sort of utopian schemes and plans of betterment and what we would later call urban planning. And he saw Riverside take shape. And it impressed him very, very deeply. And when he ultimately moved back to England, he wrote a book called Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform, published in 1898. But the book is much better known under the title it was given for its second edition, which is Garden Cities of Tomorrow, one of the most famous tracts on city planning ever written. Howard then began a movement to create a new kind of community, these self-sufficient towns that were within the sort of orbit of the big cities of Britain, but that would be, as I say, self-sufficient, a way of sort of decentralizing the metropolis. And they would be based on certain political and economic principles, including communal ownership of land, but they would also be designed in a certain way, where the houses were integrated with the natural setting, and where landscaping and the design of the public realm was given a very, very close attention. And the first of the so-called garden cities that Howard spearheaded was in Hertfordshire, called Letchworth Garden City, where Howard himself went to live. His architect was a man named Raymond Unwin. And we see the seeds of the destruction of the Garden City ideal in what Unwin wrought, because garden cities were meant to be for every man. Unfortunately, they were too nice. And because they were so beautiful, they were just drop-dead gorgeous. They began to attract, money. And before you knew it, Garden City had sort of become just a style. It had begun as a great political ideal, but now it was an architectural and landscape style. That was the case also with Hampstead Garden Suburb, which was laid out by Unwin and his partner Barry Parker, captured in this beautiful painting by William Ratcliffe, Hampstead Garden Suburb. Now, the Garden City as a style, not as a political ideal, but as a style, comes to America in part through this man. Everybody knows the name Frederick Law Olmsted, right? But this is not he. This is Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the son of the co-creator of Central Park. And truth be known, Jr. was a much more skilled designer than was his father. And he was one of the most important figures, not just in landscape architecture, but in urban planning in the 20th century. One of his great early works was a commission that he received from the Russell Sage Holmes Foundation, as it was called, to create a planned suburb on Long Island, specifically in Queens County, to be called Forest Hills Gardens. And what he did at Forest Hills was simply miraculous. Here was the Garden City aesthetic, beautifully transposed from England to America, in a community that was carefully designed down to the smallest details by Olmsted Jr. and by the architect Grosvenor Atterbury. So Atterbury, for instance, designed the station of the Long Island Railroad in Forest Hills Gardens. And by the way, the LIRR has very few stations as nice as this one. And Station Square, which is sort of the great entryway to Forest Hills Gardens, where Atterbury designed picturesque buildings in a kind of Germanic medieval style surrounding a very generous open plaza with those sort of aerial bridges and high conically topped towers and all of the plantings among them. He created what is in fact one of the loveliest public places in all of New York City. Another view of Station Square, and here we see one of his inspirations, the now rather too touristy Rothenburg in Bavaria. And in Station Square, Atterbury designed Forest Hills Gardens' hotel, the Forest Hills Inn, a necessary thing to have there because Forest Hills Gardens had a very famous tennis club, private tennis club that played host to the US Open, meaning that lots of people came to visit Forest Hills back in the day. And you see that in Forest Hills, which is built throughout the 1910s and 1920s, there is this, again, like in the English garden cities, a very close relationship between architecture and landscape architecture. But you also find that just as you proceed inward from Station Square, you find that the housing is in fact at first quite dense, that the buildings just beyond Station Square are apartment buildings that house many, many families. And then as you move along, the apartment buildings thin out, and they become row houses, attached houses, fronting big green spaces, such as you see here or here. And then as you proceed farther in, the houses become more and more spaced out. The idea was to create a community where all of these forms of housing led sort of very naturally one from the other and provided places within this community for people of varied incomes in different stages of life and so on. And it is for this reason that Forest Hills Gardens has been such a huge influence on the contemporary movement called New Urbanism. Anyway, another thing that Atterbury did at Forest Hills Gardens was to experiment very widely with the use of inexpensive building materials that nonetheless yielded great visual delight. Many of the walls that you see in Forest Hills Gardens are just these cement and pebbles, nothing fancy at all, and yet they look great. Forest Hills Gardens. Now, here's the thing. You all know from the City Beautiful movement, right? You hear City Beautiful, and what do you think of? You think of the New York Public Library, you think of Grand Central Terminal, you think of monumental buildings of circa 1900 or 1910. And yet, if you go back and you read the Great City Beautiful treatise, the one that more than any other really inspired that whole movement in American architecture. It was a book called Modern Civic Art by Charles Mulford Robinson, published in 1903. And if you read his section on neighborhood design, the design of residential neighborhoods, do you know what he describes in that book almost to a T is Forest Hills Gardens, which had not yet been built. And so I think it's important to realize that this is very much in the City Beautiful tradition. And when I say design down to the smallest detail, you can look at things like the street lamps for confirmation of this, or the waste baskets. Just about everything in this place was very carefully designed, usually by Atterbury, but even later architects like William Gompert, who designed a public school in Forest Hills Gardens, hewed to the original style. And the same sort of thing was done elsewhere. A development in Philadelphia, the Mount Airy section of Philadelphia called French Village, developed by a sort of visionary named George Woodward and designed by some very talented architects like Robert Rhodes McGoodwin. It was called French Village because Woodward wanted to, so using local materials, by the way, the local schist, wanted nonetheless to evoke the spirit of a Norman village. At the time, there were many Italian artisans living in Philadelphia, and they were put to work creating this and other developments in the Chestnut Hill section of Philadelphia, which are, in fact, very, very much kin to Forest Hills Gardens and to Hampstead Garden suburb in London. So, in order to sort of work our way up to Art Deco, and you all want to know about Art Deco because who doesn't love Art Deco, right? Nobody can define Art Deco, but everybody loves it. We're going to have to take a circuitous path. The reason for that is that it's a complicated story. It's very circuitous. And we're going to, first of all, set aside the whole issue of architectural style as we look at something that's a little bit more prosaic. Zoning. This building, 120 Broadway, was built, well, completed in 1915. And it was, by the standards of its day, a monstrously big building. There are much bigger buildings today, but there was nothing in the world bigger than this building in 1915. We began to build tall buildings, okay? And as we did so at first, the law and municipal regulations were not quite keeping up with the new developments in building technology and the new building heights. There were, in short, very few laws, for all intents and purposes, let us say, no laws that regulated the design of tall buildings, with the consequence that developers built buildings in such a way that they maximized the use of the site by simply piling one story atop another story without any sort of modulation. The buildings rose straight up from the lot line to the crown of the building. Sure, they might have a light court because, after all, you need to give your tenants some light, but the fact is that as these buildings began to be built one after the other, the streets of Lower Manhattan were being turned into dark canyons. And the canyons of Wall Street, that's a familiar phrase. You also know, if you spend time downtown, that there are these canyon-like streets. Those are the streets that were developed before 1916, because buildings like 120 Broadway, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back, because this was the biggest of all these buildings, and the people began to think, oh my God, what happens when we start building more and more buildings just like this one? Life in New York will become simply unbearable. Anyway, in 1916, the city of New York enacted the very first municipal zoning code in America, 1916. And one provision of this code was that tall buildings, as they rose, had to step back at various prescribed intervals based on a formula that took into account the height of the building and the width of the street and some other things, so that the buildings did not block the sun from penetrating to the street below. That was the whole point. Thus, you did away with the canyon effect. Now, the first buildings that were built under this zoning were classical skyscrapers. The Beaux-Arts skyscraper, in the works of architects like Bruce Price and Cass Gilbert and Louis Sullivan, sort of was perfected in the 1890s, and thereafter all the major firms, such as Carrere and Hastings, designed tall buildings, and they were often very beautiful. We have a tendency to think that tall buildings, that classical skyscrapers largely belong to the pre-zoning era. And that's not actually true. If you look at some of the early buildings that were done under the new zoning, they are classical buildings. You look at 26 Broadway, and you see the way that this building steps back so many times. Well, this building was built to conform to the new zoning code. But the truth of the matter is that the new zoning code was difficult, let us say, for a lot of architects to try to sort of get their heads around as they were designing tall buildings. You know, when we first started designing buildings that were 15 or 20 stories high, architects were, to a large extent, defeated artistically by the new building type. And it would be a good 20 years of building skyscrapers before we reliably built good-looking skyscrapers. And so with the new zoning, architects, many of them, felt they were back at square one. How do we make the new kind of skyscraper, which is mandated by the zoning law, how do we make it look good? Sometimes a building like 26 Broadway would be built, which looked great, but not everyone was able to do that. One architect who was giving it a lot of thought was a New York architect who was really a very interesting, slightly crazy man named Harvey Wiley Corbett, who employed a draftsman named Hugh Ferris. And together, Corbett and Ferris being the artist, came up with a series of studies in 1922 of what buildings could look like under the new zoning. And in their inspired vision, these buildings were dramatically sculptural, often dramatically tapered towers that really embodied the concept of tower. Corbett believed very strongly that the future of cities was in tall buildings, and that rather than continue to regard tall buildings as a necessary evil, we should embrace the tall building. We should learn to love the tall building, but tall buildings with a difference, tall buildings that were designed by him. But these tall buildings would be dramatic, and they would create a whole new skyline for cities like New York. And they would be, Corbett firmly believed, the next great age in Western architecture. There had been the Gothic and the Renaissance, and now it was time for the era of the American skyscraper. And it was on this idea that he and Ferris sought to influence the future development of New York City. Now, Corbett, as I say, was a very talented architect, always a little quirky, but in that sense, he truly fit in this era with a building like the New York School of Applied Design for Women. Very interesting school, by the way, where many New York young women learned the arts of design. And he did things like this sort of very eccentric single column facing Lexington Avenue. I mean, this is the sort of thing people were doing in the 1980s and calling postmodernism. But Corbett was doing it in 1908, 09. And as I say, this quirkiness of his fit in with the spirit of the times very well. But it was Ferris and those drawings by Ferris that would have such an influence. You look at something like this. I mean, these were drawings that Ferris did before there were any buildings that looked like this. In 1929, Ferris's drawings were collected into a book called The Metropolis of Tomorrow. And it included things like this, which looks like very much like, well, Rockefeller Center before Rockefeller Center was built. Okay, the next big thing that happens. First big thing was the zoning code. Second big thing was Hugh Ferris. Third big thing, 1922, the Chicago Tribune, the great newspaper of Middle America, decided that it needed to build a new headquarters building. And I'm sure a lot of you know this story. They decided what a great bit of publicity it would be for us to hold a competition for the design of this new headquarters. We'll make it a really big competition. We'll invite entries from all over the world, and they did so. And yes, it was a publicity bonanza. Every architect in the world, it seemed, entered the Chicago Tribune competition, and it is, without question, the most famous architectural competition of the 20th century. And the building that won was widely regarded by architecture people as not being the best design, although I have trouble thinking, I think it's a great, great building. Raymond Hood's Chicago Tribune Tower is actually one of my favorite skyscrapers in the world, but maybe that's just me. There were other entries to the competition, however, that would prove to be much more directly influential than the winning building. For instance, on the left is the entry to the competition by a great New York architect, Bertram Goodhue was his name, and on the right, a design by a Finnish architect named Eliel Saarinen, whose son, Eero, would become a very famous architect, but Eliel Saarinen, the father's design, which looks an awful lot like what? It's an awful lot like a Hugh Ferris drawing, doesn't it? It is done with that setback massing, which was almost as though Saarinen was aiming not to win the Tribune competition, but aiming to influence the way tall buildings were designed in New York City. When many architects, especially New York skyscraper architects laboring under the new zoning law, saw Saarinen's entry to the Tribune competition, they were bowled over. And that unsuccessful entry in the competition would be one of the most influential buildings of the entire century.